Just, I volunteered, but I was still very much afraid. On this particular patrol, we moved out into the valley, and so Vance was in the lead with the sniper scope. And he would look through the sniper scope like this, and then he would move 2 or 3 feet or 4 feet, and he would look through it again and move it around to see if it was Chinese. As we were coming towards our second objective, we heard a Chinese patrol. We took the ground, called it fire from our artillery. You could smell the smoke off the exploding shells of cordite. You could hear the zing of shrapnel going over your head and some of it zipping through the grass. So what happened then is we moved on, and somewhere in the valley, whatever happened, I don't know, but the lieutenant stopped and turned to me and he said, "We're lost." We went up in the back of a hill. All of a sudden, somebody said, "Halt, who goes there?" Lieutenant, who was pretty strung out, said to him, "Young man, that's no way to challenge." And when he said that, the young man opened up with his machine gun. That was the end of the lessons on how to challenge. You're in a routine though, and you're getting shells and casualties, and they're light, and they're here and they're there. You don't think much of an attack. You think you're fairly safe, so that when it does come, it's a surprise.
In the early spring of 1953, the peace talks once again stalled. To improve their bargaining position, the Chinese increased their selective attacks on key UN positions. At the end of April, the second rotation of the RCRs had taken place, and the newly arrived 3rd Battalion was ordered to defend positions on and around Hill 187. 187 is a massive hill with many ridges that jut deep into no man's land, easy targets for the communist raids.
On 187, there was quite a bit of shelling all over the hills. Patrols were going out. There was nothing amiss, but the shelling intensified as the days got along. I didn't know whether something was going to happen or not until the patrol got hit out here. About 200 or 300 yards out, they were ambushed by the Chinese. I was in a slit trench, and I started to fire the Bren gun. And then I saw the tracer bullets coming from over there at me. And I moved until only my hands were up over the parapet firing the Bren gun. The patrol from Able Company that went out that night, they found their way back, dribbled back. I don't know how many came back, but a good number of them came back, and they were down there when the bombardment came in.
The artillery attack on 187 on May 2nd was the heaviest bombardment on a Canadian position during the Korean War. But this was only a prelude to what was to come. On May 2nd, 1953, the Communists direct a devastating artillery attack on the RCR's positions on Hill 187. The Chinese target the exposed Canadian outpost deep in no man's land, but the RCRs are unaware that this is only the beginning.
I was told at the time that it was the heaviest bombardment in history for Canadian soldiers. Guys in the forward slopes, a lot of them were stunned, so when the Chinese, or wounded, so when the Chinese did come into the trenches there, they were not recovered from the bombardment. The brunt of the infantry attack came into 7 and 8 platoon down in the sharp end down there, and they got into trenches of 7 platoon and some of the trenches of 8 platoon, and that's where they took the prisoners from. Took them across the valley. Right in the brunt of the attack, right at 7 platoon down on the sharp end, was Ed Hollier.
I could see that we were fighting a losing cause, and something had to be done to get the Chinese to back off. I requested that artillery be brought down on my position. When the barrage lifted, I went forward and found the position still overrun. The Chinese were everywhere. As we were passing a bunker, I was jumped by 3 Chinese. I dove over a sandbag wall and noticed a box of grenades in the corner. I started lobbing them at my oppressors. There was an explosion, a shout of pain, and then the Chinese took off.
After the battle was over, the Chinese had retreated. Trenches were down, and some soldiers got buried in the trenches. And 4 or 5 days later, they were carrying out the bodies of Canadians. Il-187 had the heaviest casualties of the Korean War for a Canadian unit in a short battle. There were about 80 casualties. 35 of those were KIAs, or killed in action. We felt it was a raid that they had come, and it was politically motivated to influence the peace talks at Panmunjom and the Americans about casualties. This type of thing happened. You look up and down the valley, you could see this happening 2 or 3 times a week with some company or someplace getting hit.
Throughout the summer of 1953, the Communists continued to launch a series of brutal attacks all along the front. But Canadian and UN forces hold the line. In July 1953, after 3 long years of fighting and over 1 million dead, both sides finally agreed to an armistice. And on July 27th, the Canadians fired their last round of the war. For the Canadians, the war in Korea is over. 22,000 Canadians came to Korea to fight the Communists. 1,300 were wounded, and more than 300 lost their lives. The Canadians who died in Korea are buried in one place, the United Nations Cemetery at Busan. So Terry, the RCRs from 1953 are buried in 2 plots. I know there's a couple of them here. There's at least one in the back row, so we can check them out. See if we can find them over here.
Petty Redmond is from Halifax. He's probably the oldest soldier in Korea in the Canadian contingent who was killed. He was a very, very kind man, too kind to be a cook, actually. I was in the tent with Patty the day before he got killed, and I told Patty that I was going to Japan in maybe a month's time, and he pulled some yen out of his pocket, and he said, spend it on yourself. And the next day a mortar bomb came into the top of the tent, and he was killed, and there was about 7 people wounded, I think, or something like that.